Gospel Jazz. May the peace of the Lord be upon you and your family. We are here today with improvisational conversation about life, leadership, and Jesus. This is going to be our Poverty 102 course. If you haven't had a chance, please go watch the Poverty 101, and we will recap that here in just a moment, and then kind of talk about 102. What is our response then? So, Jake, do you want to kind of recap for us what we talked about?
Well, so our conversation was kind of a defining conversation about what is poverty and how do we understand the different types of poverty, what do they look like, whether that's working class poverty or generational poverty or global poverty, and then what are the characteristics of that, what do people experience, and more than anything, how do they perceive themselves, and how poverty really becomes a defining characteristic for folks, where their sense of identity is wrapped up in that poverty. And so when that happens, getting out of that or changing the situation becomes much more difficult.
Yeah.
So, in summer, that was kind of a brief summary of what we talked about.
Okay, yeah. One of the things I don't think we addressed last week was, Matthew 26:11 and Mark 14:7. Jesus has kind of that famous quote, right? He says, "The poor you'll always have among you." Mm-hmm. And, one of the things I think we did talk about a little bit last week was, your standard of living may not necessarily have to be the standard that and again, I think a lot of us do it out of a noble heart, right? Of going, well, hey, I want somebody to have everything I have. Well, maybe somebody doesn't want everything that you have. Mm-hmm. And, but again, so just talking about some of those ways, and what should the church's response be, right? Maybe
without trying to impose our standard of living or even expectations about life onto someone else.
Right, so Jesus says, right, the poor you're always going to have among you. Okay, so how do I best help and not hinder that situation? Mm-hmm. I think that's where we're hoping to.
Because there was a book that came out, gosh, it's probably been easily 10 years ago now, Toxic Charity. That I know it was formational for several people in our county, because that book got passed around to a couple groups that I was a part of. I know that it's been talked about in groups that you're a part of, about how do we best help without perpetuating the problem. And really that revolves around getting to know what actual poverty really is, generational, systemic, those kind of things, without just, because you can address the surface level stuff all day long and not really get at the actual issue of poverty.
Yeah. And again, and some of that surface level stuff does need to be met. Like James says, right? Sure. You see somebody that without clothes or without food, and you wish them well. No, right? You clothe them, right? Feed them, but again, you go, okay, you've met the surface level needs now. Yeah. And again, I think like Love Inc. and some of these other organizations that we have in our county, I think are really recognizing that relational piece. Yeah. Right, of building that relational piece, not giving into our culture where there's, and I think there's the misconception. Just as a misconception about poverty, I think the misconception to fix it, right? There's got to be some sort of instant answer, right? There's got to be something that's just instantaneous, and you go, it's probably not. It's going to take hard work. It's going to take building a relationship, and it could be a lifelong relationship, right? Yep. To help somebody, to help a family, to help. You don't build a legacy overnight, right? And so I think that's really trying to help people, and because just as we've talked about some people here before we hit the record button, my wife and I have had this conversation of going, what does true help look like for certain people? Mm-hmm. And you go, are you ready to make a lifelong commitment? And I'm ashamed to admit this as a pastor. I go, yeah. I don't know. I got a house full of kids right now. I'm trying to keep alive and teach to be decent humans, and so that's probably a terrible excuse, but I don't.
Well, this is something that we have dealt with in the shelter, especially coming to the end of the season. Now we've just concluded our third season, and part of what we're trying to do with the shelter is helping them turn the corner into something that is more sustainable. Because what we have learned, and this was such an eye-opener for us the myriad of things that have either kept a person without stable housing or decisions that led to that. And some of those are correctable decisions within, a couple of better decisions get you out of the state that you're in.
Yeah.
Willingness to walk with them. I mean, that's a big part of what we do with Hope House is walk with individuals. But at some point, the shelter's going to close because we're still just a seasonal shelter, and you've got to make the effort to change whatever it is that you're doing. I mean, we're just dealing with one of our former guests here recently, who had a couple of things that could have really helped him make the next step. He wouldn't do any of them.
Yeah.
And he's kind of stuck now. And the shelter is closed, and we're kind of like, okay, I don't know what else to do for you, because every bit of we gave you every bit of help that we had, and you still didn't follow through on the very simple things that were right there in front of you.
Yeah, that's tough.
It is.
Man. Well, and I think, that's a story, I think, of ministry just in general, right? Of trying to help people and offer the resources and offer, and it is tough, right? When people just don't. But again, I think as we talked about last week, that's where, I think we need to make sure that we keep our attitudes in check.
Yeah.
Right. Of go, well, see, that's what they get. You go, well, I'm so glad Jesus doesn't give us what we get or deserve,
Yeah.
So trying to have that Christ-like mindset of going, well, okay, we'll try again next season if, hopefully you're still around and alive and give it another go.
Well, and understanding too, what is the objective we're working towards, right? I mean, the real objective is sustainability, right? Not necessarily, and that's like working with people experiencing poverty. That really should be our objective. How do we make sure you're safe and you're sustainable? That doesn't necessarily, mean wealthy.
Sure.
Right? That doesn't necessarily mean you live like I live, but at least your needs are met.
Yeah.
Now, people want to advance beyond that. That's great, but the reality is, the objective isn't to make everyone look like us.
Yeah.
Because, and understand that people aren't projects, right? If your objective is to get them to look like me, they become your project. They become like this thing that you have to accomplish, and by accomplishing them, you have made them feel. You feel better, right? You feel, but. The truth is that working with people who are in poverty, the objective is to care for them because they matter.
Yeah.
Right? Because they have value. And this is what our culture gets wrong so much of the time. So one of the things stories that I like to tell, is about President Johnson declaring war on poverty. So in 1964, President Johnson declares war on poverty, says that the government is going to tackle poverty, we're going to solve the poverty issue, creates what oftentimes is called the welfare state, right? And creates this system, government system, to try and get people out of poverty. Well, it hasn't worked tremendously well, right? Yeah. Because fundamentally it sees people as, it denies people their implicit value, right? And it just pushes them into a system that does not value them as people, but as a need.
Yep.
And then says who's worthy of assistance, who's not worthy, and then how much assistance do you get? And the system is deeply flawed. For example, in our culture today, there's all of this talk and push towards a $15 minimum wage, raising the minimum wage. Okay, we should be paying livable wages. That's an important thing, sure. What I have yet to hear any politician suggest is that we increase the limits for assistance. Because if we don't, if minimum wage is increased, or all these corporations who are trying to do the politically correct thing and get ahead of it and are increasing their minimum wages, what they are inadvertently doing is actually decreasing their employee standard of living.
Yeah.
Because at $15 an hour, you begin to be disqualified for benefits and services. The other thing is, there is no real standard across the board for the country, which is I'm not necessarily opposed to, because how you handle things in Wyoming is different than how you handle them in New York or Maryland.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
But the government says, here's the federal limit for child care assistance, let's say.
Yeah.
250% of the federal poverty line. The states then can reduce that and make that what they want it to be. Well, that reduction isn't necessarily based upon actual costs. So in Michigan, it's like 120% of the federal poverty line. We have the second highest income, or lowest income threshold, I guess you would call it, for child care assistance. Which means a family of 4, right, that is making more than, like something like $30,000 a year doesn't qualify for child care assistance.
Yeah.
Right? It's so that kind of lack of standard that's there. So my point is, relying on systems that devalue the humanity in people and degrade them to projects doesn't solve the problem. Case in point, Johnson's Declaration of War on Poverty. So when he made that declaration, he went to eastern Kentucky, Turkey Creek, Kentucky. He went, and I'm assuming, right, that they went and found the most decrepit hovel they could find, right, for the photo opportunity.
Sure seems that way in the picture.
Sure. And there's this famous picture of Lyndon Johnson kneeling on the front porch, a man named Tom Fletcher's front porch, with 3 of his boys standing there with President Johnson and their father. And this picture is in all of the newspapers across the country the next day. President Johnson declares war on poverty. In 2014, the Church of the Nazarene, which is the church that Nathan and I are part of, we decided to declare the United States, or at least parts of the United States, as official missionary zones. That we were going to begin sending missionaries domestically, not just internationally.
Okay.
One of those designated areas is Eastern Kentucky, which is where there is incredible poverty located. So in 2014, when we did that, we gathered with some denominational leaders at Tom Fletcher's house, which his son lives in now. And I've seen the pictures of that day, and he is in as much poverty or worse than his dad was 50 years before.
Yeah.
Tom Fletcher's son, looked into the eyes of these denomination leaders and said, in 1964, the government promised us an awful lot.
Yeah.
Do you think the church could give it a try? When I heard that story, it was it really changed things for me. One of my buddies from college, his dad was there, and that's where I heard this story from. That it's interesting to me, and I have to be careful not to get too far down this rabbit trail. But when the church used to be the center of community.
Yeah.
The church used to say and do something meaningful
Yep.
when it came to people experiencing poverty. When the government stepped in and said, we're going to solve this, rather than trying to partner with the church, and rather than the church trying to continue to their work, we abdicated. And we said, fine, you want to work with them, you do it.
Yeah.
And then, which kind of created a bit of an identity crisis for the church. At least, not every church that's not mainline is evangelical, but for lack of a better word, evangelical Protestant churches, right?
Yep.
And it was like, so what do we do? Now what?
Yeah.
Which created this vacuum, which gave rise to the church growth movement, which has been an awful atrocity on Christ's church, in my opinion.
Country clubs now.
Right.
For us.
And I just read this quote has been out for years, and every so often it resurfaces. It's a Shane Claiborne quote that says, if we lose a generation of young people in the church, it won't be because we didn't entertain them. It will be because we didn't challenge them to do anything meaningful with the gospel, right? The church growth movement gave rise to entertainment, attraction-driven ministry that is solely focused upon the salvation of souls for the sake of some future eternal life, right? That doesn't really have much to say to...
We've covered all this in her podcast.
We have. So, I think so that statement, can the church give it a try? We have abdicated our role.
Yep.
Long enough. Yeah. And we want to know why we're losing young people in the church, because we've never done anything meaningful. We want to know why young people who grew up in the church are so attracted to socialism, which in most countries, which has been practiced, has resulted in death and destruction. Because they never saw anybody do anything creative and meaningful with the gospel in the church. They have no imagination for what the gospel and the church really can do within a community, because they didn't see it modeled for them. So where do they go to? They see the need, well,
sure. Yep.
Maybe a different economic and governmental system will take care of it.
Yeah.
Because they have no imagination for what the kingdom might actually look like breaking into our world. So what is our response? Our response as the church...
I think our response should now be to pass the offering plate and rebaptize everybody. Oh, sorry. No, no, you make a great... It's a sad state of affairs.
It is.
Where we find ourselves. Yeah.
And so what would it mean for the church? What would it look like for the church to step in and say something and do something meaningful with the gospel of Jesus Christ and address the needs in the places where we live, right?
Yeah.
And so I have said this before when I do these seminars, the solution to poverty in my community does not rest in Lansing, Michigan, which is our state capital, and does not rest in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Yeah.
It's right here. And again, if the objective to our work with those experiencing poverty is not to make them middle class, I don't need billions of dollars to lift everybody out of poverty.
Right.
What I need is... And if we define poverty as a lack of ability to participate in community, my solutions are how do we bring those folks up to the standard of living for our community, not how do we make everybody multimillionaires, right? We have to set good goals in this, but our work is to be the faithful people of God.
Yeah, and that's where I think you guys know me well enough where I certainly try not to get too conspiratorial.
Yeah.
But I do honestly think I won't sit here and bash the government. I think there's some good intentions.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But again, right, then you watch how unfortunately, right, those programs have been abused or they've created
other problems.
Exactly.
Well, and the reality is, systems always marginalize someone. Right? Systems are always marginalizing someone, and there's a lot of beauty to a democratic republic like we have. Right?
Sure.
One of the downsides to it is we elect people, and at this point in our history, we elect professional politicians, not even more normal. I don't want to say more, but there was a day in our country where we were electing people just like us.
Yeah.
Right? At this point in our history, let's just be honest. We're electing wealthy professional politicians.
Or celebrities,
right, to that role.
I mean,
but
for better or worse.
For better or for worse. One of the downsides to it is we invest in them the responsibility to make decisions about things which they know nothing about.
Yeah.
Right? One of the issues with, for instance, the gun control debate is we're asking people who know very little about firearms to make legislations about firearms, which is where lobbying is supposed to help solve that problem, which it doesn't help it. It exasperates it and makes it worse.
Got to get rid of those high-capacity magazine clip round things.
Right.
For the
I can tell you how many times...
71
Niner. Yeah. I've seen
Have you
people
held
say
a gun?
things about firearms.
Well, I mean...
Exactly.
I watched a movie with some guns in it once. They look dangerous. Sorry.
But The same thing is true about poverty, right? People who have never stepped
There you
foot
go. Yep.
or never sat down and heard the story of somebody living in it
Yeah.
are making legislation about how we serve those folks and who
Right.
is and isn't worthy of it, and what markers, define success. That's part of the failure of our system. Again, systems always disenfranchise somebody. So, we could tear it all down and start over again, but the new system we rebuild is going to be equally flawed. It's just going to disenfranchise somebody else, right? That's just the nature of things. Yeah. I think when Jesus says the poor you will always have with you, that's kind of what he meant, right? There's always going to be somebody disenfranchised by the world we live in, right? Yeah. It's a broken, fallen world. We don't live in the garden anymore where everybody has everything that they need to live in harmony with one another. So until we get to the city, right, until we get to the New Jerusalem, somebody's always going to be disenfranchised.
I think you see that in Jesus' time, right? Yeah. Rome was a powerhouse. Economics were good. Money was flowing, right? People were educated, right? It was ideas were transferred and
Careful,
spread.
because it sounds an awful lot like America today.
No,
go ahead. You were making an important point there. Sorry.
That's exactly right. It's the same thing. There were still disenfranchised, poor people that.
The gap between the wealthy and the poor was gigantic. Yeah. Very much like it is today.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I have to understand, too, people want simple solutions to dynamic issues.
Yeah.
Redistributing wealth and closing that gap does not eliminate poverty.
No.
Right? Again, poverty properly understood. Right? You can put more money in people's wallets, but if we don't do anything about the psychology, if we don't do anything about the self-interest, right? I can find somebody experiencing poverty, people I know and have worked with in the past, right? Who they've internalized this, they've done all this. If I had the means to give them $100,000 to reestablish themselves, it would not solve the problem that was within them. Mm-hmm. It doesn't magically make that thing go away, which is, again, where the solution needs to exist within the community where together we work for the common good, we work for the betterment of one another. We make sure that the community is accessible to everybody within it. I mean,
and I think I've heard some psychologists and stuff talk about this with the hierarchy of needs, right? That when you are living in an affluent society, and again, even those that are on that borderline of poverty, whatever, right? All of those basic needs are met, right? My shelter, my food, safety and security. Again, we could debate all those to some extent, but then you do, right? You're left with, well, now what? And to me, and I think that's where, and again, I don't want to see anything happen to this country, but that is where you go into a third world country where when that is all you have is each other and your neighbors. Right. And there's a different attitude. There's a different spirit about things. There's hope and fellowship and trust. I mean, all those things, right? That I think I don't know who coined that phrase, but we've watched our society here the last however many decades go from the front porch, right, to that back porch, right, where everybody was, right? You knew your neighbors. The kids played in the streets.
Yeah.
All those things, right?
And now we've kind of sequestered ourselves.
Yep, let's move to the backyard, and I'll put up my privacy fence, and we have our grill and our pool, and you do your thing, and I'll do my thing, and hope you don't need nothing,
Well,
and
if you do, we don't know each other well enough that you're probably not going to ask.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, so just solving the money part of poverty does not solve the cultural issues, and it doesn't even solve the class issues, right? Yeah. So Ruby Payne's work on understanding poverty is really helpful. Now, not everybody agrees with it. Yeah. There's been a lot of folks who have kind of rejected some of what she writes, but
her name's Ruby. Come on.
She has, in her book, Understanding Poverty, she has these hidden rules among classes.
Oh, yeah.
And she looks at people living in poverty, middle class, and wealth, and how they approach things. Like, for instance, possessions, right? In poverty, people are what's most important. In middle class, it's things. And in wealth, it's one-of-a-kind objects, legacies, pedigrees, right? Money, if you're in poverty, money is to be used and spent, right? people who get a stimulus check, let's say, go out and spend it? Because all they know how to do is spend money, because so little comes in, it's always going back out to meet needs. So when there's an influx, there is not that logical conclusion that we perceive to be a logical conclusion that says, save it for the need.
Rainy day. Yep.
In middle class, it's to be managed. It's to be governed, right? And we do a little bit of spending and a little bit of saving and a little bit of... And wealth, it's to be conserved and invested, right? This is a really important one. Food. In poverty, think about food, the question is there enough? Quantity is important. Yep. They've gone without, they want to make sure... if you ever have the privilege of being invited to the table of somebody living in poverty, that you ever have that opportunity, they will be more concerned with, did you have enough? And they will put out more food that they can afford to, because they want to make sure nobody's going hungry. Middle class, the question is, did you like it? And it's all about quality, right? And wealth, was it presented well? Right? So again, just to illustrate, we talk differently. We use different words to mean the same thing. So putting more money in the hands of people living in poverty doesn't solve that class issue. It comes back to community. How are we living and participating in community with one another? So one of the passages of Scripture that has been defining for us is from Isaiah 58, which is... third Isaiah, if you will, which is written when the people of Israel are coming back from exile.
What? You didn't write it all? Sorry.
Different podcast episode. And so the people who are coming back, if any of them were alive when the exile started, they were young children who maybe have faint memories of Jerusalem's former glory.
Yeah,
Maybe. And the other ones have lived with the stories of how wonderful it was, right? Forgetting the fact that that Jerusalem, particularly the temple, was destroyed by Babylon.
Yeah.
Right? So they grow up hearing the stories of the grandeur of Jerusalem and longing to go back to that place, believing that when they get back to that place, it will be like everything was before the exile. And they return to rubble.
Yeah.
Right? They return to everything being desolate, being torn down and broken, and they come back to literally nothingness, and from that nothingness to rebuild, right? And what does God tell them to do? Isaiah 58:12. This is from the Message. You'll use the old rubble of past lives to build anew. Rebuild the foundations from out of your past. You'll be known as those who can fix anything. Restore old ruins, rebuild and renovate, make the community livable again.
Wow. Be a good name for a church.
Maybe. We should do that. And I read that and I go, but of course that's what God does.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, the language of rebuilding from the ruins and things, but really, those age-old foundations, in the NIV it says the age-old foundations, right? You'll be called to repair broken walls, restore our streets with dwellings. But it's nothingness, right? These old foundations, they're nothingness. Of course, from out of that, God says, we will rebuild community, because God always creates ex nihilo.
Yeah.
He always creates from nothing. If you go back to the creation narrative, there was tohu and bohu. There was these cousins of chaos, right? There was nothingness and chaos and separation and void and placelessness and spacelessness, right? And out of that nothingness, God creates creation. Out of the nothingness of the rubble left by Babylon, God creates something new. Yeah. He's always creating new things from the nothingness. Even us, right? What are we?
Yeah.
We are sinful, broken people who are created to bear His image. Nothing apart from Him, right? We're not capable of fixing it ourselves, and yet, even within us, He creates new from nothing.
Yeah. Yep.
So, of course, that's what He calls us to do. So, when we're talking about poverty, localized within the community, it's what are we willing to do as a church, as the people of God, to solve those issues. How are we going to make the community approachable? How are we going to make it livable? How are we going to allow God to use us to create community from nothing? Right? This call to work with the poor. God does not call us to work with the poor because he has a soft spot for the poor. Right? He calls us to work with the poor because that is the truest expression and fulfillment of what God does.
Yeah. Well, it's back to being in community with each other, right? I mean, that's the whole thing. It's not that he needed Adam or Eve; he wanted them, though, right?
Sure.
He loves community. He loves family, right? And that's and again, providing those pieces, and building that community. And again, and I don't know. We live in a rural setting. I guess my mind says maybe that's easier to do in a rural setting than an urban setting. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's easier to do the other way around. But
the grass is always greener.
Well, it always is. But even during COVID stuff, I mean, it still seems like there's still the busyness of schedules and life, and at what point do you really try to slow down, right, and build those relationships and take that time?
Yeah. One of the things that, and I don't know if this is still as true as it was 5 or 10 years ago, but whenever this kind of conversation comes up about doing things in your community as the church, there's always the tension, or there had been the tension of, well, you're talking about a social gospel. And you are diminishing the actual gospel that's on the page of the Bible. And I think just our response to that initially is like, that's ridiculous. That is an incomplete reading of Scripture to begin with. This is a while ago, probably 10 years ago now. I ran across an article from Scott McKnight who addressed the social gospel issue. And one of the things that he says in that article is, whoever told you that you had to choose between the social gospel and, I don't remember what the thing he was contrasting it with, the gospel of salvation only. He said that's not scriptural. And one of the things that I think it was in that article that he referenced was 2 places in Paul, that Paul writes in New Testament letters, in both Hebrews 13 and Galatians 6, where he says to do good. And Scott McKnight kind of breaks that down, and he says, look, that phrase, to do good, is the actual physical labor of building the city. And he said in particular it relates to dock work and making sure that commerce comes into the city. Now again, I think we can get off track really easily and start going, well, God wants us all to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. And that turns into a whole other heresy.
Sure.
But if we understand the simplicity of what Paul's talking about, he says, look, and this is something we see throughout Scripture. We've talked about this before, that God instructs us to say, to live in such a way that it is revealing the fact that we are in a particular place for a particular reason, that we're not just supposed to be looking for the exit. We're supposed to invest and work towards the benefit and the health of the city. And that means, in part, not just, it's easy to invest yourself in the places that are easy to invest yourself. I mean, that's part of what makes it easy, is it's easy. Yep. It's easy to go and hang out with people who are wealthy and try and get them to pay for things or whatever you determine as easiest. But to go and work with the poor, those that are struggling, to make that investment and help them connect with a sense of community. I love that idea, the picture of the poor lack a sense of community, and that is part of what keeps them in that poverty cycle. And what better place for the church to engage, to simply say, hey, we're going to help you, we're going to give you a place to belong.
There is a real sense. They do have their own kind of community, but it's still very much a sense of isolation, right? Not an ability to participate in the bigger, broader community. Scott McKnight, and his daughter, just over the last year, wrote a new book called A Community or a People, called Tov. And Tov is the Hebrew word for that good or goodness. I just listened to a podcast that he was on with Scott Daniels.
Interesting.
These 2 Scots talking. And he talks about that book, A People Called Tov, and that a people who are really called to do to goodness. I mean, and it's interesting. We've heard that phrase, right? We sacrifice the great for the good things. He kind of turns around and he says, "We're always interested in greatness when God calls us to do good." And he talks about in the church and church growth movement, and we want to be great, and the culture that creates these celebrity great pastors, right, who one by one just keep falling. And they spent a lot of time talking about Bill Hybels and Willow Creek, and in the pursuit of greatness, we lost sight of goodness.
Wow.
And I'll say it like that because that's basically how they say it. So if Scott Daniels and Scott McKnight can say it, I can say it.
Throw the Scots under the bus. Just repeating what I heard.
But this also goes back to this atonement theory thing we've been talking about, right?
Does.
If the gospel is that Jesus is king, which goes back to what we started talking about a year ago as well, right? The King Jesus gospel, and that argument that was going on with Scott McKnight and some others, kind of those open letters the rest of the world got to look into.
Yeah.
But if the euangelion, I don't remember if we talked about this in our podcast, we did at church, right?
Yeah.
That euangelion, which is the Greek word for what we translate as good news or gospel.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. Was a Roman term that meant, and the euangelion in Rome was there's a new emperor on the throne, and this new emperor, and it's good news, there's this new emperor who's going to make life better, and it's a new day for Rome, and it's turning a page. It was this optimism, good news, there's a new emperor on the throne. Paul is the one who really uses that phrase, euangelion, and kind of co-ops the Roman phrase and puts it in the context of the gospel of Jesus Christ and says, you want to know what the real euangelion, the real good news is? It's not there's a new emperor in Rome. It's there's a new there's a new king on the throne, the eternal throne. His name is Jesus. He has conquered the thing, killing us. He's brought us new life. That's the euangelion. Okay. Now, one of the passages, or one of the things that has always got, for the last several years I've been wrestling with, was when Jesus goes to Nazareth, and he goes to his synagogue, or the synagogue there, he's asked to speak, right? And he reads from Isaiah, I've come to proclaim good news to the poor, set the captive free, all this, right? And he says, the fulfillment, this has been fulfilled and you're hearing it today, right? And he talks oftentimes about good news for the poor. Now, that phrase, good news for the poor, is something that I could get excited about and understand and believe. But at the same time, there was in the back of my mind this unsettledness about what is that really that good news, right? Because our understanding of the gospel has been salvation through faith. It has been Jesus is king. But what does that really look like in many new kingdom? Understanding euangelion as there's a new king who sits on the throne, right, changes that understand that dynamic of what good news really is for the poor. To proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim this good news to the poor is that this government that has kept you ostracized, right? Despite maybe their best intentions, they have kept you suppressed. Let me tell you about a new king who sits on the throne, who, yes, might not lift you out of this poverty now, but let me tell you about a resurrection people he has created and mobilized within the world who are living into this new life because he's on the throne that you can be a part of. Now that's good news for the poor. Right? That when Jesus says, I have come to proclaim good news for the poor, now that's some real good news for the poor. So, in the church, a couple other things real quick. John Wesley, who's for us in the Wesleyan tradition is a primary theological father, he believed that works of mercy, working with those in the poor, was a means of sanctifying grace, that it was one of the ways by which we would be sanctified, one of the ways by which God would do his work of grace within us. And so here's one of his quotes. All therefore who desire to escape everlasting fire and to inherit the everlasting kingdom are equally concerned to practice this important duty. It is equally incumbent on young and old, rich and poor, men and women, according to their ability. None are so young if they so desire to save their own souls as to be excused from assisting their neighbors. None are so poor, unless they want for the necessities of life, but that they are called to do something for the relief and comfort of their afflicted. as the church, part of that means giving even the people experiencing the greatest poverty the voice and the ability to speak into solving poverty for one another. It really is about community.
Yeah.
And there are some practical things. I mean, in the Church of the Nazarene, again, we lost this in the church growth movement and kind of in the 60s and 70s, but there was a time where Phineas Brzee, one of our founders, even said he was opposed to expensive church buildings because they tended to, quote, necessarily to drive the poor from the portals of the so-called house of the Lord. We don't need forts and barricades. We need a marching, conquering army.
Wow.
Right? That we would have small, unassuming buildings that the poorest of the poor could walk into and feel like they were at home.
When did he say that? Do you know what the date is when he said that?
It would have been sometime before he died in like 1919. 1925, something like that.
Wow. So it wasn't last year. That's interesting.
No, it was more than 100 years ago. I would say probably 1890s if I had to guess.
Yeah.
Look at even some of the church buildings here from back in the day. I mean, they're impressive structures.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The stained glass, and again, I'm not poo-pooing
Now,
anything. Yeah.
Right.
But
Now, I'm gonna counter that a little bit in a moment, but I'm gonna counter my own argument because there is still something to be said for this. But understanding that a place that the poorest of the poor can walk into.
mm-hmm.
The reason I quit dressing up on Sundays, I mean, I wear jeans and a button-down shirt, and this was before we started the shelter. I didn't even know what was coming next. I just had this sense I need to stop doing that so that if the poorest, most not person walks through our doors, and they feel like they're on par with how I'm dressed, and they should, it doesn't matter how anybody else is dressed. That's they can feel at home, and it has made a big difference. When we did open this shelter and had people come into church, that was one of the things we heard more than anything else. I feel like I can come. Mm-hmm. I don't have to feel bad about being dressed in what I have to be here. So, one thing that I just want to read because I think it's going to connect particularly to what you were talking about with place. And it kind of holds some of the stuff in tension, right? Because we don't want to become... we don't want to become so almost simplistic and that we kind of become Gnostic, right? But we want to understand that not everything is wrapped up into this. It was 2 years ago today that Notre Dame burned.
Oh,
right.
This came up on my Facebook memories as something I shared on that day that was written. So this is what somebody smarter than I wrote. Some commenting on today's catastrophe seem to understand the hollowing of a material realm that is the purchase of the cross. Yes, the church is not buildings, but it is also not immaterial. Where creation, stone, glass, wood, fabric, and metal, has for millennia been ordered in one space towards the resurrection, it is natural for the body of Christ to mourn this loss, to seek to restore this sacred house, to renew its standing as a sign, before its arrival, of the world that is coming to this world. Even as the church seeks by the Spirit to preserve our memory, we have to have the mind that is in Jesus Christ, that we might continue to tell the beautiful story of our God, of the God makes the world the world we in love, of the God who saves the world by offering all of God for all of the world. We do good to preserve the artifacts, the art, the architecture, the music, and the books that emerged from centuries of shaping nature in the form of the cross. When we understand that with the first Christians, that the salvation made possible by the cross extends to the cosmos, not just human souls, but human bodies, not just ethnic groups, but nations, not just ideals of things, but their actualities. That the cross saves human ingenuity and creativity. What we make of the good world that can inherit the new creation. We remember to steward the whole of the natural order, to practice care of the creation, awaiting the transfiguration of this bright blue marble, terra firma, which is in the inheritance of those who humbly lay down their life with God for the life of the world. Today and for a long time we mourn, but not as those without hope, and not as those without an intergenerational task of restoration and redemption in front of us, enabled by the Spirit that indwells the church. Now, I butchered some of that. And also, that was written specifically thinking about the Notre Dame burning.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's so applicable to thinking about what does it mean for us as the church to respond to people experiencing poverty. Right? It is not to neglect the physical and the material. Some of the most holiest work we do might well be meeting physical material needs.
Yeah. Yep.
Might be restoring community in physical, tangible ways. Might be making this place livable again in ways that are tangible, that have brick and mortar to them. And in so doing, we are ordering the world in the form of the resurrection. If this world is to be destroyed, why build anything?
Yeah. Yep.
Right? Why fix or restore anything? But if this world is to be redeemed and restored, then and made right again, then the things that we rebuild and renovate, brick and mortar, concrete, in lives, meeting tangible needs, right? All of that, whether it's building housing, community centers, access to medical care, all of those things, right? If the world's going to be destroyed, then that's futile work that just gets us through the day.
Yeah.
If the world's going to be redeemed, then investing ourselves in those concrete ways is a sign to the world that there is hope, and it's a signpost, and it is first fruits of everything that is to come.
Yeah.
It is ordering the world towards resurrection, because we are not a people who hopelessly lets things go to hell, so to speak.
Yeah.
We are a people who rebuilds because we serve a God who rebuilds. We are people who resurrect because we are a people being resurrected. We are a resurrection community. We serve a God who resurrects.
Yeah.
This work of poverty is about resurrection.
This is a great message for the church in general.
Right.
I think for this, especially this last year with COVID, right? Of feeling beaten down, right? Feeling set back, right? So, dude, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. And hey, we hope you found that helpful as well. And I'm anticipating, I think these 2 episodes will hopefully be some of our more watched and downloaded. But hey, we hope you found this informational. And again, you can reach out to either any of us on Facebook or social media or whatever. And again, if you have questions or seek some more answers, I know especially these 2 guys would love to come and give a presentation at your church, your school, nonprofit, whatever other organization you may be a part of. As Jake was saying, a lot of this was taken from a presentation that he and Nathan both do, talking about poverty. So if you'd like that more in-depth and more personal, maybe to a group or something that you have going on, please reach out to us and let us know. I know these guys would love to come and talk to your group as well. So thanks for tuning in. Make sure you hit that like, hit that subscribe, and God bless you. Have a great day.